I will introduce our first speaker. Aditya S.K. works with animal ethics on raising concern about antispeciesism, wild animal suffering, and long-termist approaches to animal advocacy. He has a background in animal protection law. He is also the organizer for the Animal Save Movement chapter of Hyderabad called Hyderabad Animal Save, and has regularly organized demonstrations and vigils to promote veganism and moral consideration for non-human animals. Additionally, he works with Impact Academy as a program manager for their AI safety field building program in India. So thank you so much for being here, and please welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aditya. Thank you, the Hive team, for inviting me, giving this talk. It's great to be here. And as Steph introduced, I work with animal ethics as their outreach coordinator. I give talks on anti-speciesism, wild animal suffering, and also at the intersection of long-termism and animal advocacy to different audiences, which includes general public, academics, high school students, also the EA community, the AI safety community. So the goal is to get them to talk about anti-speciesism and also look at the intersection of like what future risks can arise for non-human animals. And this is the first time we're giving a talk on digital sentience. We have been giving talks on anti-speciesism with consideration included for digital sentient beings. So we thought it would be interesting to share with the audience here on how our efforts have been on changing, or how our efforts on anti-speciesism advocacy can be used to change attitudes on digital sentient beings or artificial sentience. All right, so throughout this talk, I'll be covering three categories. One, I'll briefly introduce risks for sentient AIs and why we feel they are important. And secondly, we'll also talk about the strategies we've been using for anti-speciesism advocacy and how they can translate digital sentience advocacy. And finally, I'll also talk about spillover effects and how we can leverage them to do advocacy for the consideration of digital sentient beings. Right. So to share an anecdote, initially when I saw a few authors in the EA space talking about digital sentient beings, I've been involved in the animal advocacy space for a while. And when they were speaking about digital sentient beings, I quite didn't get it. I thought, oh, there's trillions of non-human animals suffering and there'll be many more suffering in the future. Why should we actually care about digital sentient beings? And on a little more exploration, I wanted to share why I feel this is important. And some of the authors have highlighted how, insofar as digital sentient beings are possible and more computation involves more subjective experiences, it is possible that we come up with artificial sentience that has like very fast computation, which also includes a more number of experiences in a given amount of time. And secondly, it is also possible that we currently don't know what the states of mind are. Like we are constrained in many ways, like the limitations of biology constrains the amount to which we can suffer. But for digital sentient beings, it is possible that they can suffer much more than how much biological beings can suffer. And finally, it is also possible that it is cheaper to create like many more copies of digital sentient beings once we achieve the technology. So there could be many more copies that are created, and there's this creates a potential. This creates a large potential for intentional or accidental harm. So all the three categories combined, it is very likely that there could be an astronomical scale of suffering of digital sentient beings, because many thoughtful people have argued that there could be many more digital sentient beings in the long-term future than biological beings. So insofar as that is the case, and insofar as their interests are not considered, there could be an astronomical scale of suffering. And while it seems very unlikely, I mean, a lot of people might think that this is very speculative, but a lot of philosophers have argued that this is possible, and there's a lot of conversation growing. As we can see, this conference is being organized, so there is a lot of interest. And philosophers like David Chalmers have claimed that there's 20% chance that in the next 10 years we might see artificial sentience. And given the trend of like human attitudes towards like alien species that are sentient, it is very likely that we would also disregard their interests, because we have mainly been like humanity has been skeptical about extending the moral consideration to beings that are less like humans. So how is this relevant to the anti-speciesism advocacy that we do? So for those of you who are not aware, substratism refers to the discrimination against sentient beings that have a different substrate. So insofar as this is possible that there might be sentient beings with a different substrate, and speciesism is similar discrimination versus members of certain species. So both are unjustified for similar reasons. So it is very relevant to us as animal advocates because we condemn the discrimination against members of different species because they are sentient, and irrespective of their species, we should consider their interests. So similarly, we should animal advocates would also be interested in promoting consideration of interests of sentient beings of different substrates. And yeah, speciesism is not just discrimination between humans and non-human animals. It's also discrimination between different forms of animals, the ones with simple minds versus complex minds. Say, for example, humans are more likely to give moral consideration to some species of non-human animals that are more complex, that show more sophisticated cognitive capacities, as opposed to non-human animals with simple minds. Say, for example, I don't know, like small invertebrates. Similarly, it is also possible that once we have digital sentient beings, they would go through a phase where they are initially similar to non-human animals, where their moral status is considered similar to non-human animals. So it is also possible that we give more moral consideration to artificial sentience that is more like humans and displays more complex capacities as compared to AIs with simple minds. So these two would be unjustified for similar reasons, because what matters here is their capacity to suffer, that their interests are being violated, as opposed to what is their complexity or what is their capacities in terms of performing complex reasoning. And some biases that I wanted to highlight on why some people might be skeptical of like extending moral consideration to digital sentient beings. One could be emotionally salient footage with non-human animals. One of the major approaches that a lot of advocates use is to show videos or images of animal suffering to connect with the empathy of people, to get them to care about animals. But with digital sentient beings, that might not be the case. So we might be more prone to this bias that, they don't suffer like I do, so I might not give them as much moral consideration. But they might be suffering even more, even if they don't show the same kind of expressiveness of suffering. And the second thing is availability bias. I guess through the sci-fi that we are all familiar with, we might have a certain idea of how digital sentience might look like, but it is also possible that it might be completely alien to what we currently know. So we might also be prone to the availability bias, that we imagine that the artificial sentience might look like a certain way. It might look just like a few lines of code, or it might be a completely different form of artificial sentience. And then there is the status quo bias, which is a lot of animal advocates might think about, we should only focus on the current approaches, the institutional reforms, etc., but they might miss out on the future opportunities that we can change the trajectory of in terms of like raising consideration for artificial sentient beings. And finally, there is also a possibility that we might have a bias towards AI, similar to humans, in the sense that we are more anthropocentric when we are extending consideration to humans. So it is possible that there might be a bias towards caring more about AI as opposed to non-human animals as well. So yeah, just wanted to share some of these biases that might impede our reasoning when thinking about digital sentient beings. And to now share a little bit about the strategies that we propose when advocating for changing attitudes of digital sentient beings. So there are two broad approaches that we take. One is like a targeted approach when we are also addressing say animal exploitation. We could either take like a targeted approach where we are focusing on institutional reforms or like targeting a specific policy, or we could address broadly the risk factors which enable these risks to arise. So when I talk about targeted interventions, so these are some of the examples that I found out through reviewing the literature that authors have posed. One could be like scenario analysis of the types of AI minds. Like I mentioned, we have very less idea on how digital sentience might look like. So it seems like a good idea to do more analysis and more research on what kinds of AI minds might arise. And the second thing might be creating a new field of study. Currently, no such field of study exists. So it's great that NYU is spearheading this research. Even for wild animal welfare, at some point, it was considered very speculative. There was no data, but we are creating a field of study called welfare biology, and that is gaining traction. So similarly, we can also create a new field of study focused on understanding artificial sentience or digital sentience. and also designing positive human-robot interactions. So the initial interaction with AI might be a precedence for how we might interact with digital sentient beings in the long-term future. So insofar as that is the case, it would be important for us to set the right precedence by not creating like hostile forms of AI or things that might elicit negative responses in people towards anything that's AI. There have been propositions made on having global or local moratorium, like Thomas Metzinger talks about it, and also coming up with safeguards for in case digital sentient beings are there, coming up with safeguards so that their interests are respected. Like Nick Bostrom has written a paper on propositions for digital sentient beings. And broad strategies could include concern about sentience, in general, spreading concern about sentience. This seems like a robustly positive direction because, insofar as everyone cares about sentience, this increases the political will. If and when digital sentience arises, people would campaign for protecting their interests on the basis of their sentience and their capacity to suffer. Also, as I said, concern about simple minds and not just focusing on certain types of complexity or like sophisticated reasoning, but as opposed to just in general raising concern about sentience and also beliefs about who may be sentient. It's important to also, I guess like advocate for the possibility that there might be beings with different substrate that will be sentient and not just biological beings. Yes, and finally, talking a little bit about spillover effects. So spillover effects are a very common phenomenon in epidemiology, economics, psychology, where one intervention also affects non-participants. So in this case, we are talking about moral spillovers, where our advocacy on anti-speciesism has positive spillover effects on sentient AI. And this could make things easier for future advocates who are talking about digital sentience, insofar as there's already prevalent attitudes about sentience and caring about the interests of sentient beings. If and when there is digital sentience arising, then there would be like sufficient public interest in protecting the interests of sentient AI. There are, and this is borrowed from Sentience Institute's paper on moral spillover. They have highlighted three different forms of spillover effects. Behavioral, which is like, okay, where behavior in one context has a spillover on another behavior. Say, for example, I'm conserving water. It has a positive spillover effect on energy conservation or switching off electricity. There could be a contextual spillover effect, which is like, oh, I care about animals, and that has a spillover on my attitudes towards or my moral preferences towards sentient AI. And the third form is temporal spillover effects, which is, say, me caring about a dog or me going vegan now would increase the likelihood that it will have positive spillover effects in the future towards, I don't know. So there are some examples of this. So in the case of anti-slavery activists, a lot of them were pro-animal. These were just some pictures of some leaders in the anti-slavery movement who were also pro-animal rights. So this is just one example. I would also encourage you to think about, when you changed your mind about a certain, say, prejudice, what encouraged you to change your mind about it? What was the content of the reasoning? Did your previous beliefs also have an influence on how you thought about this new thing that you're going to change your mind about? And insofar as that is the case, such that, your belief in environmentalism is causing you to care more about wild animal welfare, say, for example, which is usually not the case, but then maybe people who believe in anti-speciesism might be more prone to change their minds about digital sentience. This is borrowed from Katrina Manoli and Janet Pocketad's paper on moral spillover in human AI interaction. So it's like voting for AI animal rights might translate to frequently voting for sentient AI rights. Similarly, there might also be negative spillovers, like abusing an animal now could have a negative spillover on frequently abusing sentient AIs in the future. So this was just to give you a representation of how it might look like. So I guess the main reason why we advocate for combining anti-speciesism and digital minds advocacy is because it looks less weird. If you go to the general public talking about advocating for digital sentience, they might consider you more weird as opposed to talking about anti-speciesism and integrating concern for sentience as well as digital minds within it. We've been doing it since 2020, and so far there have been no like backlash or like no one questioning, why should we care about digital sentient beings? So potentially this could be one avenue that advocates can leverage to make use of it. And these are some takeaways that I wanted to share. Sorry, this was badly calibrated. Right. So if you're interested in learning more about our work, please visit our website. It's called Animal Ethics. You'll find some of the articles we've written on the intersection of long-term future and non-human animals. Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, we have a little bit of time for questions and comments. Does anybody in the room have a question or comment? Yeah, how about you start us off?
Thank you for your talk. So I am interested about the positive interaction that you mentioned, in the sense that we know that affective states are for informing the animal to behave, to go towards or to fight and so on. And probably what we need is something to code something in the artificial intelligence that we are able to behave, to give signs for us to understand. And I mean, because if it's suffering, it will express in some way. And I would like to know about what are the plans for that.
Right. I think that's a good question. I think there is currently a lot of uncertainty about how and what suffering is. In biological beings, it's expressed in some ways. Say in invertebrates, sometimes it's expressed in very different ways. And in digital sentient beings, it's very speculative on how that might look like. So I guess there is a lot of uncertainty in researchers working on consciousness and theory on how the suffering might be expressed. So I guess that's a good safeguard to keep in mind among people who are trying to develop these forms of sentience, on what kind of indicators we could look for to kind of assess if they are having like a painful or something that you would classify as suffering.
Other questions, comments? Yes.
I think we just talk to people about this. Is that just like through informal conversations, or have you like done any like surveying or kind of polling? Or?
No, we haven't done any survey or polling. This is mainly anecdotal from the animal ethics team's experience giving talks in universities and to general public. We always have a section that talks about sentience. And in there, we also include like a slide where we talk about, it shouldn't just be restricted to non-human animals. If and when there is sentience in digital minds, we should also extend consideration to them. And we try giving some references to like some movies like Blade Runner or Terminator, like, they might be sentient.
You mentioned positive interactions between robots and people. Do you have any examples of like work that looks like that?
Yeah, I think there is a field of study called human-robot interaction science. I don't know the exact name of the field, but they do many studies on that. I think Sentience Institute has also published some reports that look at how positive human-robot interaction can have positive effects. I think they might be better fit to talk about it, but then, yeah, I'm not that aware of.
One related question is, you mentioned before that it would be good to have safeguards and of course to also slow or pause AI development so that we can ensure proper treatment of AI systems. I was wondering if you had ideas about what kinds of safeguards would be feasible and worthwhile. Like we can stipulate that maybe indefinitely pausing the development of AI for 2 or 3 or 4 decades until we can figure everything out would be ideal. But supposing that does not happen, what would you recommend AI labs do in order to put some safeguards onto either how they treat the AI systems or how users treat AI systems to make the treatment better?
That's a great question. I want to caveat my answer by saying that I'm not an expert in understanding what kind of exact safeguards should be there. I think there have been some very thoughtful people who have done work on this. My feelings are that, there needs to be, at least like, as you mentioned, indicators of what negative experiences or positive experiences might look like in these beings. What are the indicators of sentience in the first place? Because we might not know when a digital program is sentient or not. And yeah, I guess this would be the main thing, and also something that Thomas Metzinger mentioned, having some form of a moratorium, that especially a multilateral moratorium, such that they don't try creating this unless and until there are sufficient safeguards in place and there's research in place on how to avoid negative outcomes through this research. Yeah.
Okay, great. We have a question from online, and then we might have time for one more in the room. The question online from Owen is, why should we only extend the moral circle to beings with experience or a capacity to suffer? Perhaps digital minds, which are trying to attain goals, should also be considered, even if they cannot suffer. So why only sentience instead of, say, consciousness without valence or agency without consciousness as a basis for moral considerability?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it depends on what one values when extending moral consideration to other entities. If they value goal-directedness, then it probably makes sense from their viewpoint to extend moral consideration to entities that don't suffer but are in some way like reinforcement learners or something. But I guess a lot of us agree at this point that what matters is the capacity to suffer or the ability to suffer in some ways, at least when we are deciding whom to grant moral consideration to, at least in our society. Like, I guess we would not treat a computer system and an animal that can suffer in the same way. So it kind of highlights our intuitions about whom we want to grant moral consideration to. So insofar as what we care about is sentience, which we argue at animal ethics should be like the main baseline, I think it makes more sense to extend moral consideration. But then if they think they would like to extend moral consideration to non-sentient systems, yeah, I think it would be a logical extension.
We have time for one quick question. Go for it.
Yeah, it's a bit of a follow-up. I'm wondering if, given that it's not depending on what you think about consciousness, right? It might not be actually very likely at all that AI systems, like when conscious, would be like sentient in this like suffering kind of way, given that like they don't, they don't have the biological like need to, right? So there's, I guess, a likelihood that they might be conscious and might have goals and might have frustrated goals and stuff like that, and you might think that that's morally relevant, but like, given that it might actually be quite unlikely that they might be sentient, then yeah. Do you think that for AI you might broaden your like moral considerability thing from sentient to something that is more likely that AI would have? Does that make sense?
I didn't understand the last line that you shared. Right. Broaden the moral considerability to something that is not sentient.
Yeah. Like,
We should probably
yeah.
continue this during
Okay. Yeah.
all right.
separate discussions, just in the interest of time.
Yeah. But to quickly answer your questions, I guess it's better to take a precautionary approach. It is possible that substratism is true and that there's no possibility for digital sentience to arise, and it might just be goal directedness or agency in some way, but no suffering. Which would be good from one perspective, but it's better to take like a precautionary approach and promote more research and advocacy insofar as that, they do gain the ability to suffer, so we have safeguards in place, then assuming that, they might not, so let's not do anything. So yeah, that's how I would consider that.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Aditya.